I lived with the struggle of dissonance for a long time. And when the message came to me and struck me, Matt, that there's a heavenly Father who will never let me down. And he has always loved me for eternity past to eternity future. You can see how I'm getting teary-eyed now. When I heard that message, I went down to that altar because I believed, and it was true in my heart. And I felt a warmth, a sensational, overwhelming warmth in my body. And I knew that was his revelation in me. So cognitive dissonance doesn't explain the origins of Christianity?
My comment in response to that would be, good historical practice must account for the maximum amount of knowable facts. And what you just said does not account for Paul, because Paul was not grieving over Jesus' death. He wasn't trying to figure out what was going on there. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So he's not grieving over Jesus' death and trying to make sense out of it. And his argument that if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, the Christian life is not worth living. But Christ was raised, therefore we will be raised. Therefore the Christian life is worth living. That argument makes no sense whatsoever unless they truly believed Jesus had been raised from the dead.
Yeah, this is one of the most common responses that I see from Christian apologists. It's the one that Mike Licona, I've seen repeatedly, argues that cognitive dissonance can't explain the origins of belief in the resurrection because of Paul. And I mean, I think the biggest problem that I think that runs into is that Paul wasn't at the beginning of Christianity. And so if the question that we're talking about, if the question of cognitive dissonance, the question that it's trying to address is how belief in the resurrection began, Paul's conversion has about as much to do with that question as the conversion of Brigham Young has to do with the origins of Mormonism or the Book of Mormon, has about as much to do with the origins of Christianity as the conversion of Tom Cruise has to do with the origins of Scientology, which is to say none at all. I mean, in both of those cases, I mean, especially with Brigham Young, I think it's questionable whether Mormonism would have thrived, would have succeeded without Brigham Young and his incredible organizational impact that he had. And I think in the same way, when we're talking about Paul, what we're really talking about is the success of Christianity. And I think it's really questionable whether Christianity would have succeeded if it wasn't for Paul coming on board. His influence is, incomparable. But Paul's conversion has nothing to do with the origins of Christianity. He was already coming into a belief that existed prior to his conversion. And so that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing, though, is that I think often apologists overplay how different Paul's beliefs as a apocalyptic Pharisaical Jew were from the movement that he was opposing. Christianity, they often say, like, Paul was diametrically opposed. It was 160 or 180 degree change from what he believed as a Pharisee to what he came to believe as a Christian. And they make the difference as the gap as wide as possible so that it seems more miraculous. But Christianity, early Christianity, was pretty dang close to Pharisaical apocalyptic Judaism. They agreed on a lot of things. And so, I mean, Paul's early opposition to Christianity was not as much, being opposed to your polar opposite as being opposed to your cousin. It was like Baptists versus Presbyterians. It really was the narcissism of small differences. So it wasn't that big of a leap for Paul to change his mind and go from Pharisaical apocalyptic Judaism to this other sect that just really tacked on the end that you're expecting has already begun in the resurrection, in the death and resurrection of the Messiah. But I think that apologists often also underestimate how attractive that belief would be to an apocalyptic Jew like Paul. if you believe that the end is just around the corner, and for Paul as a Pharisaical Jew, he is hoping that his devotion to Torah will help usher in the end of the age, will help usher in the eschaton. And he is already dealing with centuries of cumulative dissonance over the problem of delay. The Jewish consciousness, eschatological consciousness in the first century AD under Roman occupation, under Roman oppression, is dealing with, you read the prophetic traditions and things like Habakkuk and Jeremiah, Daniel, and you get this sense throughout the prophets, throughout the apocalypses of dissonance, of this question of how long, O Lord, until you do what you promised? How long until you release the justice that you promised, release the prosperity, the peace, the exaltation of Israel? If we are your people, why are we suffering? That's the question that energizes Paul. And so he exists with this tension already. Christianity comes along and they say, that end that you're hoping for, that release of justice, that transformation of all of creation that you're looking for, that vindication has already begun. It's already begun. The Messiah is here, and he is risen, and he's seated at the right hand of God. So he is the first fruits of the general resurrection just around the corner. And if you read 1 Corinthians 15 and the way that Paul talks about the resurrection, you can see that this is very important to him, not just logically. It's important to him emotionally. It's important to him because it establishes that he is in the end times, that as an apocalyptic Pharisaical Jew, he has always been hoping for, he's been waiting for. And it gives him that ground to stand on. And so it resolves dissonance. So Paul already did have dissonance as an apocalyptic Jew, and Christianity and the claim that the Messiah has come, he's risen from the dead, helps reduce that dissonance. So cognitive dissonance does have relevance to Paul, even though in terms of the origins of Christianity, Paul's conversion is a non-issue.
Just to tag on to what you just said, in using kind of some modern examples plus bringing up what you're saying, Paul is one of the unique situations of Jews who's actually having to engage with these Christians. So you could say, one might go, well, how come all the Pharisaic Jews in Palestine weren't converting by the numbers, or it wasn't successful at the end of the day in Palestine? As we hear, it really wasn't at the end of the day. But how many Jews were engaging Christians on this level? This is the question we have no way of knowing for sure. But a modern example, I saw a Twitter post by you pointing out that what we have is, this is like the modern prison guard who is finding out about the enemy. In a lot of cases, most prison guards are looking at the inmates like, you villain, you enemy, you don't, but they have a lot in common. And if they give them the opportunity to really kind of listen, at some point, a kind of conversion moment can take place on how they perceive that inmate. And you'll find prison guards who end up sleeping with inmates. You find prison guards who end up adopting the ideas of inmates. And this is the subordinate group that is actually causing the influence on the person who's kind of the dominated one. So there's some psychological thing that takes place. And I've mentioned this before. That huge apologetic that they use, well, what could explain how this guy could radically convert? And they use convert, right? Which Paula loves to say, nice try. It's not a conversion. It's more, you could call it like that, but that's not the best thing, because he's not going from one thing radically to a whole nother thing. And I've said this, like, this guy's already a believing Jew who already has that worldview. Like, he believes angels. He believes in the resurrection. He believes in, it's already there. You're, in fact, a better miraculous position to claim is like, how do skeptics who don't believe anything or have a completely like a skeptical rationalist epistemological framework come to believe angels, demons, ghosts, miracles, Jesus resurrection in the 21st century? That's a better case to make than saying Paul, a Jew at this time who has to engage these Christians, becomes one. you're better off just arguing with modern people. And like, so it's one of those things that's never baffled me. And I love your analogy. It has no dent on the origins of Christ being risen in like any estimation I can see. It's just this guy packaged it in such a way, and he went on a mission out here to Gentiles and really made it popular. He really pushed it in front of more people. But because he is the one we have the documentation for, I'm really curious, even in my studies, how much impact did he himself actually have alone? Because at every location, just about, he's engaging opponents. There are others who are already doing this. So we may be giving more credit to this guy than he really had. I'm not so sure. I mean, sure, he's important, but like, how many other players are in this game? And Paula Fredrickson said it. He's late. Paul's late. He is not early. He's already where it's supposed to be ending any moment now. And the dissonance is just bottlenecking big time.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that for apologists, I mean, especially for the minimal facts style apologists like Mike Licona, Paul is really, really, really important, because Paul, and 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is the only source that we have that is an eyewitness himself to the resurrection. I mean, obviously, apologists like Licona and Habermas, would probably believe in the, traditional authorship of Matthew or John. And so they think that there are other eyewitnesses, but Paul is the only one that they can actually mount as an argument with skeptics, with critics, that, as the minimal facts argument states, the vast majority is trying to mount an argument based on what the vast majority of scholars, both believers and non-believers, agree on. And so Paul is where you can go to mount that argument first and foremost. So they think that Paul is their best bet as a help to them in their argument, but it actually is more of a harm to them than a help, because Paul, being the only eyewitness testimony to a resurrection appearance that we have, Paul's experience, his conversion experience, was not the kind of corporeal experience that we have in the later narratives in the Gospels, in Matthew, Luke, and John. Paul's experience explicitly was a visionary experience, the way he describes it in Galatians as a revelation that took place in him, the Son of God being revealed in him. The word apocalypsis that he uses is the word for a revelation. It's the word that is the book of Revelation. It's where we get the word apocalypse from. And so he is explicitly describing a visionary experience. And obviously you go to the book of Acts and you can see that Luke understood, the author of Acts understood Paul's experience as a visionary experience. So there's really no argument to be made from Paul for the early experiences of Jesus being corporeal experiences of a bodily resurrection, of a body that had come out of the tomb. And that gives them a lot less to stand on. And so, I mean, from my perspective, Paul, however you cut the cake, is not a good response to cognitive dissonance. And it's not a good response. If you're going to argue for the bodily resurrection, Paul isn't the guy for you.
That's why canonically they find ways, as we did in our previous video, to find a way to kind of make them all speak the same thing. I do like what you said here, because it brings me to my own personal experience with Jesus. I have never denied I had an experience. To this day, that experience is still with me. I went down to that altar as a young boy who has a hero as a father, a real biological hero on this earth who's my father. But the message that I received with the dissonance of my own life, of not understanding how this is my hero and he's invincible and he loves me more than anything in the world, yet he's alcoholic and he's abusive verbally to me, my brother, and my mother. I lived with the struggle of dissonance for a long time. And when the message came to me and struck me, Matt, that there's a heavenly Father who will never let me down. And he has always loved me for eternity past to eternity future. You can see how I'm getting teary-eyed now. When I heard that message, I went down to that altar because I believed. And it was true in my heart. And I felt a warmth, a sensational, overwhelming warmth in my body. And I knew that was his revelation in me. So it became true. So now everything else based on that experience and that message became that hinge pin that I could say, this is true. I am not going to deny my experience. So Paul's experience is what I think is a driving force. And oftentimes I think that is where their validation is coming from, is that experience. But when they start making the historical claims of what really is the case, and they go to the Gospels and such, there's a whole different can of worms. So I'm not denying the experience, and this isn't me mocking or scoffing, but I legitimately think this guy was dealing with stuff and found a way to handle it. Like I had my Heavenly Father because of the struggles of my real one on earth that filled that void for me. And I lived moment to moment, and that voice, that inner voice talking, I thought it was God the whole time. Later on, as I deconverted and started learning more about my brain, because I was an addict who struggled with addiction, started learning more about evolution, how we came to be as a species, etc., I started to realize the 2 footprints in the sand story. Jesus carried you when you were weak. That there was always 2 footprints, and it was always me. And it was me talking to me. So it was almost like some of those really good movies that at the end of the movie, you realize that you thought there was someone with him the whole time, but he was really like in a psychosis or something, but it was really just that one person, almost like Wilson, the volleyball, and on the island, like he kept him company the whole time, but it was really just him by himself. That's how I felt about this. So I'd love to see wherever you want to take this, but I wanted to give a little personal of mine. And I think that I can relate to Paul in terms of dealing with that struggle, but then everything becomes valid through that experience. Yeah. And that's why I think he could say like, hey, I didn't come to you with lofty words of wisdom. I didn't come to you with all this like super, because if that were the case, anyone else could sway you. Yeah. They had the power of the pneuma experience. Yeah. And that's what I think sold them on Jesus.
Yeah. I think, just jumping off of that, an important point I think that is worth addressing that apologists also make in response to cognitive dissonance is they'll say, well, you can't psychoanalyze people from the past. And I think that that can be a valid response. I think that people often get a little bit trigger happy with trying to psychoanalyze things that we don't have that kind of access to. But cognitive dissonance is a hypothesis, and anything that we're dealing with early Christianity, with something that has the sparse level of data to go on, we are in the practice of making and testing hypotheses. And so you have to test this hypothesis against other hypotheses. And the problem that apologists often mount in opposition to an explanation like cognitive dissonance is to say that, this can't explain it because ... some psychological feature of the apostles. And so they will then mount their own kind of, minor psychoanalysis to say why cognitive dissonance can't work. And so I think either way you cut the cake, when you're dealing with history, you are dealing with people and you're dealing with people's motives. And so there is a degree of psychoanalysis that is inescapable. But I think when talking about Paul specifically, talking about the tensions that Paul was living with as an apocalyptic Jew, I don't think you have to get into psychoanalysis to be able to say what his eschatology did for him emotionally and the emotional reality of his life living under Roman occupation. I mean, these are the realities in the real world, and you don't have to sit Paul on a couch to be able to describe those things. But I also think that there's one thing that, minimal fact apologist Gary Habermas, a point that he makes that I actually agree with, and it's in an article that he did with a clinical psychologist where they talk about the hallucination hypothesis, and they say, as a criticism of the hallucination hypothesis, they say that the hallucination hypothesis doesn't work because it's describing a symptom and not a cause. And this is something that I actually agree with. I think that when you talk about hallucination, you have to talk about what's causing the hallucination. If you don't think that it's based in reality, if you think it's based in something subjectively, what is the subjective driver? What is the subjective engine of that experience? And I think cognitive dissonance is that engine. But I just wanted to read, and maybe we can close out the video here, but I wanted to read this section from Carl Jung's study of UFO sightings in the 1950s. He develops this idea that he calls visionary rumors. And in talking about visionary rumors, he says, if it is a case of psychological projection, this kind of flurry, this rash of sightings of UFOs that was taking place in the 1950s, specifically in the United States, he says there must be a psychic cause for it. The basis for this kind of rumor is an emotional tension. And I think it's important to note that this is he wrote this in like 1958, so it was just around the same time that Leon Festinger was doing his work on cognitive dissonance. But he speaks of an emotional tension having its cause in a situation of collective distress or danger, or in a vital psychic need. This condition undoubtedly exists today, insofar as the whole world is suffering under the strain of Russian policies and their still unpredictable consequences. In the individual too, and think about Paul when listening to this paragraph. In the individual, such phenomena as abnormal convictions, visions, illusions, etc., only occur when he is suffering from a psychic dissociation. That is, when there is a split between the conscious attitude and the unconscious contents opposed to it. Precisely because the conscious mind does not know about them and is therefore confronted with a situation from which there seems to be no way out, these strange contents cannot be integrated directly, but seek to express themselves indirectly, thus giving rise to unexpected and apparently inexplicable opinions, beliefs, illusions, visions, and so forth. And so that right there, I mean, he speaks of that inner tension, which is another way of speaking of cognitive dissonance, that dissonance that gives rise to things that your conscious mind isn't expecting, but is then presented to you as a way of relieving that tension. And it comes from within. It is a projection, but it's a projection that your conscious mind isn't aware of. It's the bottle has been shaken up. You're so filled with dissonance, so filled with tension that it seeks a way in from the unconscious mind. And I think that the way that Paul speaks consistently, that hypothesis fits the data of Paul's experience.
One last thing on that. You mentioned Russian and the Russia. If you just interchange the word to Roman occupation, right?
Which I did. You saw your
I saw you did that already. And I'm thinking to myself, this makes a lot of sense. Living under Rome, and who knows what might happen. They don't play around, especially with Jews. Look at what happened with Pontius Pilate. I mean, we have historical precedents to see, these people they got to be careful what they do around these Romans. So there's a threat, there's a fear, there's a constant what's going to happen. And there's also this God, what are you going to do? God, what are you going to do? God's got to do something about this. And in fact, we see this, I think, we not only see this in 4th Ezra of a constant cry out, why God did you let this happen to our temple? But we see this in Revelation really big time. But that's why I used my experience to point out, like, I anachronistically am saying it was my father. Right. That wasn't what I thought when I was there. Yeah. When I was there, this message of a loving father was the best message I'd ever heard consciously. Unconsciously, my father is the greatest thing in terms of heroes that can potentially ever be in my life. There's no other thing that can go higher. So I'm giving you the answer when I explain that. The thing is that's not what I thought when I was there. I wasn't consciously aware of my dad in that. And I do go with a lot of the scientists who are starting to say our parents, our biological mother and father, are huge engines to our worldviews, to what we think, even in a biological or neurological sense. Even before we're born, we're neurologically wired to be yearning and seeking for our parents. That's why infants cry. They know that the mother will come to them. And so there's a neurological wiring going on there. But then once they're born, once they're aware, for 4 or 5 years of your life, you're completely dependent on something other than yourself, another agent that keeps you going. And it satisfies you emotionally, psychologically. It satisfies you in every aspect, physically, like everything, consciously, subconsciously, the whole nine. So when you grow to separate yourself from mother, I cannot think that there isn't something working in the God concept or in the worldviews that we have that play into that biological evolutionary process. So we just went off track, but it's relevant, I think, to the bigger picture of what you're suggesting here. And I hope that more people will engage in cognitive dissonance theory or hypothesis to understand the origins of what we might be looking at here in Christianity.